Welcome, everyone that's dropped in. Just give it another a minute or so for the last people to join. Okay, let's get started. Let me share my screen. Hope you can all see it. So welcome to Tanzu for Dummies. This session is being recorded. It'll be on YouTube. We have a Q&A panel open, but I would ask you to leave any questions to save them up for the end, so we can answer them all together. So yeah, Tanzu. VMware Tanzu proposition is all about containers, and it's all about Kubernetes. And it seems almost like the whole IT world is currently kind of obsessed with containers and Kubernetes. You know, why is this? So containers are rapidly becoming the way that applications are being packaged up and deployed. And they're so close to the way applications are built that containers are kind of becoming the default way that a build process around an application spits out, you know, the compiled code. So we're moving to a situation quite quickly where a lot of new applications, especially what we call cloud native applications, are built around this concept of deploying the code, deploying the parts of the application using containers. It's growing really quickly, but like with all things in IT, it'll take a long time before it becomes normal. This is a long-term thing. You know, in 10 years' time, we'll still have plenty of applications that are not container-based. But at some point or another, the majority of new applications will certainly be delivered as containers. So why is VMware so involved with containers? Well, VMware has made its mark in managing kind of the layer underneath applications, the virtual machine, the virtual server. That's what we know them for. That's the core technology, and the core thing that VMware brought to the market is the way to manage at scale virtual machines. Just move something, 1 second. There we go. So why is VMware now interested in something that's kind of above the level of the VM? Well, the thing is that if you start writing your applications as containers and deploying them, the role of the VM changes, and it can change quite a lot. Right now, with many application architectures, you have to install the application, the parts of the application, directly on the VM. And many of us you know, have been doing this for decades. But with containers, the game changes a bit. Instead of having to install the software on the VM itself, all the VM has to do is run the container, and all the parts of the application that are contained in the container They all run inside. They're neatly packaged, and they don't really interact much with each other. It's a very clean way of running code. So what will happen is, as we move towards the container being kind of the default way application code is run, is that you'll end up not needing as many VMs, but you will end up having a huge amount of containers, and they'll probably be running on a VM because, in the end, having to run a container still requires an underlying server with an operating system, which you still need to manage. So that means that VMs are not going away. That part of the abstraction is still extremely valuable. So these technologies, and one is not replacing the other, they're complementary to each other. But we are going to see a shift. The majority of application code is going to end up in containers, and a container is going to be run on VMs, but we'll probably need less VMs. Well, the emphasis moves away from managing VMs to managing containers. We're moving up the stack. It's more application focused. Now, to manage containers at scale, you need something called an orchestrator. You need some kind of technology that enables you to manage the dozens or hundreds or thousands of containers that you'll end up having when all of your big line of business applications are deployed as containers. In the last few years, Kubernetes has become the de facto container orchestration technology. And the rest have kind of gone away. So it made sense for VMware to, of course, get heavily involved in Kubernetes. They've gotten so involved, they've made Kubernetes the core of this entire Tanzu initiative, which is quite impressive, considering it's not software they developed themselves. Right now, all the public cloud providers are running Kubernetes and are giving you a way to run your applications in their clouds using Kubernetes. These are managed Kubernetes offerings. And why do you need a managed Kubernetes thing? Well, Kubernetes has historically been hard to deploy. It's not simple software, it's complicated, consists of many moving parts. And it was hard to get started, and that's changed. Kubernetes itself is no longer really hard to deploy, but it's the stuff around Kubernetes that is still quite hard. We'll get to that in a second. Now, like I said, the shift from VMs to containers obviously means that it affects VMware, and VMware has seen for itself the opportunity to move up the stack and get involved, and that's why VMware has this huge Kubernetes-based play now. And this whole play is what they call Tanzu. So Tanzu is just the name they've given this whole initiative. So when you ask what is Tanzu, it's not really one thing. All right, Tanzu is an initiative, right? It's a plan. But Tanzu is also all of the technologies and products you need to actually do Kubernetes as part of VMware's stack. VMware likes to divide up their products into what they call their build, run, and manage strategy. And they've made all of Tanzu a part of that. So all of these different parts of Tanzu end up popping up in all these different parts of this build, run, and manage framework. Now, I already alluded to it a bit earlier, but there's something interesting about this whole container stuff and Kubernetes stuff. Kubernetes was not developed by VMware. And many of the technologies and many of the tools and products that you need today to run large container-based applications at scale on the public internet, it requires a huge amount of different tools and different technologies, and the majority of these are not proprietary. They're not closed source, they're open source projects. And that is a bit of a kind of a 180. It's a bit of a flip to what we're used to with VMware. VMware, like many other companies, built the technology that we know them best for, as closed source proprietary software. And every company like that, they always include open source bits and pieces. But here it's the other way around. The majority of the tools needed to run containers at scale and all the stuff around it are basically open source projects, and VMware adds their own bits of proprietary code and solutions and products to that to make a complete offering, to make a complete stack. Because they're so dependent on these open source projects, companies like VMware, well, companies like Red Hat as well, they will involve themselves very heavily in these open source projects to kind of influence their direction, to steer them, and to add the stuff to these projects that they need. It even goes further than that. Companies like VMware will actually start new open source projects to fill in a bit of functionality or tooling that is currently not offered by the open source community. And they will open source these tools as a way to give back into that community. So what VMware has done with Tanzu is they've taken a selection of these open source tools, of these open source projects. They've combined them with their own proprietary tools, and they've created a stack, a portfolio of products, which we call Tanzu. And it is, they have an opinion on how to do Kubernetes, how to do containers, how to do all the stuff you need around containers. So we're talking, we speak of an opinionated stack. And the more opinionated a particular collection of these tools together is, the less choice you have to pick and choose which bits and pieces go into it. VMware has largely, not completely, but largely chosen for you which combination of tools and open source projects fit together to make a managed Kubernetes offering. And this is what we call Tanzu. Now, why do we need all these things besides Kubernetes itself? Well, the problem is this. Kubernetes is just one very small part of the puzzle when you actually look at the whole landscape. Getting Kubernetes running, like I said, these days, it used to be hard. It's not hard anymore. You can install Minikube or some other, very easy to deploy Kubernetes distribution. You can get going in minutes. You can start developing your applications, spitting out containers, getting them running in Kubernetes very, very quickly. That's not the problem. The problem is everything else you need to get an application actually running in production. Now, if you think of very large web services as applications, think of Netflix, right? They consist of thousands and thousands of pieces. And to get them all, these distributed architectures, to get them all working together, you need very complicated network technologies, right? You need to think very, very carefully about things like monitoring and about things like governance and security. And a lot of it's around networking, These are distributed services. Modern applications consisting of all these containers are distributed architectures, or at least they're supposed to be, to get the most out of this model. But distributed architectures bring all these unique challenges. You have to do things at scale. You have to separate out logical components from each other and make them loosely coupled. And that requires a very different skill set and very different tools, different than the ones that we're used to in the VM world. So a large part of the Tanzu proposition is not so much Kubernetes. I mean, Kubernetes is a very important core part of it, of course, but it's all this other stuff you need to actually start using containers as a building block to build distributed application architectures. So take all of these topics, all of these challenges, and VMware has kind of ordered them. And the ordering you see on the screen now is kind of my translation of how they're ordering it. These are kind of the main topic areas we're talking about. Things like observability. How do I monitor my application? How do I keep logging? How long do I keep the logging? How do I filter on it? Network and security, role-based access. Who gets to reach which application? If I'm developing an application in containers, which developers get to push something to production? And building the containers themselves is part of the story as well, right? How do I actually take my code, make sure, validate that it's secure, validate that it's got in there what I need, then spin out a container and then push the container to Kubernetes to get it to actually run. And ingress, networking, how do I get people to get to my application services? How do the application services talk to each other at scale in this very distributed fashion? So you translate all of these topics, all of these challenges to the Tanzu portfolio, you get this. Now, this is a very busy slide. But this slide is the entire Tanzu portfolio as it exists right now. And it also contains, in this slide, I've included many of the primary open source projects, open source tools that are part of Tanzu, that are required in Tanzu to get all of this stuff to work together, that enable a lot of this underlying functionality. So the dark blue blocks are tools and products that VMware, that are closed source, that VMware has either developed themselves or acquired through acquisitions. The light blue ones, or the teal colored ones, are pure open source projects that anyone can download and install and use. But VMware leverages them, uses them very heavily as part of Tanzu. And some things are starting to get a little bit vague. Many of the tools around building containers securely are open source projects, but VMware packages them and turns them into parts of Tanzu and adds a lot of their own stuff to it. So it becomes a little bit hard to talk about something that's purely an open source project or not. Now, of course, on the bottom side of this slide are the things that many of you will already be familiar with, vSphere, vSAN. Some of you might be playing around with VMware Cloud Foundation, which is VMware's new way of managing a lot of the infrastructure stack all together. And in dark green is the core of the Tanzu stack. It's actually the managed Kubernetes part itself. It's what VMware calls Tanzu Kubernetes Grid. It is the core, it's the heart of Tanzu. It's the thing that makes Tanzu a managed Kubernetes offering. And we're going to zoom into Tanzu Kubernetes Grid in a second. Now, like I said, this is a very busy slide. There's lots of stuff here. There's lots of products, lots of stuff you'll never have heard of, right? Now, I'm not going to go into any of these in detail. It's beyond the scope of this presentation. And, you know, Google is your friend. But what's important to remember is that VMware doesn't really expect you to adopt all of these new tools and technologies all in one go. They're not going to sell you all of this stuff all in one big pack. They're going to do what we kind of expect VMware to do with these kinds of suites of tools. They're going to divide them into versions, into editions that can be sold, and where it becomes slightly more manageable to talk about. So they have introduced the concept of Tanzu Editions, and we'll get to that in a second. Because a lot of the technologies you're seeing on this slide are probably new to you and to most people who are dipping their toes into Kubernetes and into containers, VMware and me and others at ITQ like to talk about a kind of a journey, a customer journey, from thinking about running applications in the traditional way with VMs, you know, with physical servers, with, you know, full kind of stacks, to thinking more about cloud native ways of building and running and managing and deploying applications. And you're not going to get to that journey all in one go, right? It's a journey. It's going to take a long time to get there. It's going to take a long time for companies and IT cultures within companies to mature and to change their way of thinking about how you approach application architecture and how you approach turning business needs into services that are, you know, distributed, highly available, and built up from microservices-based application architectures. The way VMware is positioning all of these different Tanzu tools and technologies with the Tanzu Editions follows that customer journey. VMware have a really nice slide about this, and I love this slide because it kind of illustrates this this journey. And you know, you start with stuff you know. You start being infrastructure focused. You start with vSphere, with VMs, with vCenter. VMware has put a lot of effort into making the barrier to entry for these technologies quite low in the Tanzu portfolio, and in Tanzu Kubernetes Grid itself. And then as you start to dive into containers, as you start to redevelop some of the applications you might currently have developed in-house to be more microservices oriented, to be more cloud native, then more and more of the more application oriented parts of the Tanzu portfolio start to become very interesting and very relevant. So as you move higher up the stack, your maturity increases, the ability you have to build complex application architectures using these tools and technologies increases. And you'll start to see more use cases for the stuff that VMware is adding to the Tanzu stack. So if you look at the Tanzu editions, this is kind of how they break down. There are 4 editions, and currently 3 have been officially released. Tanzu Advanced, in fact, went GA only, so general availability only a few weeks ago. We know Tanzu Enterprise is coming. I've added my own little arrow here, which indicates this maturity journey. You start small, you get started quickly, you experiment a lot, you fail a lot, because failing is part of this journey. And you start to learn how to do applications like this, how to manage the stuff around it, how to manage the networking, storage, the containers themselves. And as you mature in this journey, and you become more DevOpsy, right? You become more agile. You're going to have to start breaking down some of these islands inside your organization, because the Tanzu portfolio, if you look at all these technologies work together, you've got storage bleeding into containers. You've got networking bleeding into it. Many organizations right now have separate storage teams, separate network teams, separate virtualization teams, and completely separate from developers. If you go from left to right in this slide, you'll have to start breaking down some of those barriers and just have to start talking to each other. Because to get these modern application architectures working at scale requires everyone to be in the same room. Principally, but maybe even literally. Now, you might be wondering, so which products then of the previous slide are included in these different editions? And we'll get to that. But first, we have to dive a bit deeper first into the core managed Kubernetes part of the Tanzu offering, Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, and understand later why I need to do that first. So Tanzu Kubernetes Grid is kind of the core group of technologies that VMware has put together to do a managed Kubernetes, to be able to deploy Kubernetes, to deploy Kubernetes clusters and all the stuff you need around the clusters, and also to lifecycle those clusters. So you can update the version of Kubernetes, you can update the different technologies that are part of a Kubernetes stack. But it also enables you to deploy additional Kubernetes clusters. And they're using a very specific part of the Kubernetes open source project to do that, called Cluster API. It allows you to, from a single starting point, a management Kubernetes cluster, to spawn additional Kubernetes clusters. And if you've never done anything with Kubernetes, you might wonder, well, why would I need more than one cluster? Well, why do you need more than one vSphere cluster? You'll end up with situations where it becomes extremely useful to have a specific part of your organization or a specific group of developers have their own cluster. Like I said, VMware tried to make the barrier to entry to a lot of this stuff very low. They know that the majority of their tools are currently being used by vSphere admins who might not be very familiar with these technologies. So they spent an awful lot of time trying to combine, trying to embed all of these new concepts into vSphere, which you are familiar with. So this creates some interesting things. With Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, you have the option of running containers. In Kubernetes, we call containers pods, basically, of running pods inside ESXi. But that's not the only place you can run them, but you have that option. And this allows a lot of this stuff to kind of appear to the vSphere admin as if it were a VM, which is something you're familiar with. But like I said, that's an option. You can also spawn additional Kubernetes clusters using Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, and then run workloads in there. And this layer, this kind of core group of technologies is pretty flexible. It doesn't need to run on vSphere at all. They've made it that you can run the same stack on Amazon, on AWS or Azure or Google, and do the same stuff in there. But if you are on vSphere, and specifically if you are on vSphere 7, you have the option of running these pods inside ESX. These different ways of deploying Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, I've kind of outlined in this slide. And the terminology starts to get quite complicated at this point. And this is where a lot of people start getting confused. You can, when you buy Tanzu Kubernetes Grid as part of a Tanzu Edition, you have several options. Now, I think on the left is how most people will be using Tanzu. They will either get it as part of a kind of a full VCF stack, or it'll be added to vSphere 7 as an extra licensing option. And then, then you can start building these Kubernetes clusters. And the default place, the first place you kind of start when you have vSphere 7 is always have an embedded cluster, to have the Kubernetes cluster itself, including all the pods that are in it, running inside the hypervisor, inside ESX, as if it was a VM, a bunch of VMs. But the next cluster you deploy, you will deploy kind of outside of that embedded world. And it's basically just a bunch of VMs as you know them, with Kubernetes installed on top of that. And we call those Tanzu Kubernetes clusters. Tanzu Kubernetes guest clusters is how I usually refer to them. And some parts of VMware, in some slide decks, you'll see them refer to those kinds of clusters as workload clusters, but the concept's the same. The version of Tanzu Kubernetes Grid that is not dependent on vSphere to run, so the version that can run on AWS and Azure, is sometimes referred to as Tanzu Kubernetes Grid M for multi-cloud. And the embedded version of Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, or refer to that as the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid service. Now in this slide, you'll also see on the right a different Tanzu Kubernetes Grid offering. And I have to mention this because it's still part of our landscape at the moment. Tanzu Kubernetes Grid I, for Integrated Edition, is what used to be Pivotal Container Services. It is also a managed Kubernetes offering, but it's an older one. It's one that was developed originally by Pivotal. And Pivotal, of course, has been reacquired by VMware. And I'm not sure if this is an option you can still buy, but there are a lot of customers that are currently still running it, and they will be for a while. VMware has the challenge of creating a migration roadmap in future between customers currently running TKGI, otherwise known as PKS, and then migrate to Tanzu Kubernetes Grid Kubernetes, which is a very different type of managed Kubernetes offering. So to zoom in a bit now on Tanzu Kubernetes Grid service, the kind of the embedded version of Tanzu Kubernetes Grid that's included inside vSphere. Now, you might have heard of most of these technologies because they were announced about 2 years ago as Project Pacific. Now, VMware doesn't use that term publicly anymore. I do know that they still use it internally to refer to this part of Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, the part that integrates very tightly into vSphere, and where you run your first, the core management cluster of Kubernetes inside ESX, embedded inside ESX, as if it were a VM. They use technology called CRX to do this, where they kind of wrap the container in a very, very lightweight layer that makes it seem to vSphere as if it's a VM. And it means you can manage it like a VM. And it also means that it turns up in the UI like a VM, or at least like something similar to a VM. But when you spawn an additional Kubernetes cluster out of this construct, those clusters themselves are also visible in the vSphere UI as a managed object. So first we only had VMs, and other things like maybe vApps, and you don't see those very often, and resource pools. But adding a lot of these Kubernetes objects to the vSphere interface. Now, the way VMware wants to order and organize your management of all of these objects, they're introducing a concept called namespaces. Now, this can be confusing because there is also a concept called namespaces inside Kubernetes itself. The two, while called the same, are only partially related. They're only really related to each other inside that management cluster, which we call the supervisor cluster when you run it embedded inside ESX. The namespace construct that they've introduced in vSphere allows you to manage both VMs and native pods and complete Kubernetes clusters together. And you can do things with them together, like authentication, like assigning a resource pool to them. So you can actually divvy up how your underlying vSphere cluster resources are going to be used by these different parts of this Tanzu Kubernetes Grid landscape. VMware has a really nice slide on just the Tanzu documentation website, this one, that really kind of shows you really well what I'm talking about. On the left side is what it looks like when you run these vSphere, these Kubernetes objects inside ESX. And as you can see, they're at the same level as the VMs. They're treated very similarly by vCenter. You do stuff with them in the same UI. But the moment you spawn an additional cluster, then you kind of lose visibility of what's inside that cluster. The cluster itself is managed in the namespace, but if you then run workloads inside those spawned clusters, then you start to lose visibility. Those objects are not tracked by vCenter in the same way. So you have these two different models, the embedded model and the non-embedded model. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to running pods, to running your application workloads inside the embedded model. Again, I'm sorry for the verboseness of this slide. It's quite busy, but I really wanted to get everything in there so you can reference it later. Right now, today, there are some limitations. If you run your pods, if you run customer workloads inside the embedded cluster, you get advantages, as in extra visibility, but you can't do everything. You're going to run into some weird things, and right now you require NSXT to do it. The networking inside these supervisor clusters requires NSXT, so not everyone has NSXT. So that might be a non-starter. It might be that simply because you don't have NSXT, you immediately must spawn one of these external clusters and start deploying your workloads there. But that's fine. Right now, the challenges and some of the limitations around the supervisor cluster, around the embedded cluster, I would recommend today that you try to avoid putting workloads in that cluster. What I would advise people to do right now is to, when you get started with Tanzu, immediately create a guest cluster and run the customer workloads in there. Now, the guest clusters have several advantages, differences to the supervisor cluster. Probably the most important one is that the version of Kubernetes that VMware built embedded into ESXi, it's kind of a custom version of Kubernetes. It's not the same Kubernetes you would download from the Kubernetes project website or Git repository. But the Kubernetes that you spawn when you make an external Kubernetes cluster is the same version as what you would download from the internet. That the word for the difference between those two is called conformance. We call Kubernetes cluster installations that are the same as the one you download from the official project. We call them conformant clusters. Currently, the embedded vSphere cluster is not Kubernetes conformant, and that's not a problem for many workloads. But we, with ITQ, have already seen that there are differences, and those differences can cause challenges. Now, VMware is hard at work removing many of those differences and making some of these limitations go away. But today, I would recommend not trying to run your own workloads inside that supervisor cluster. Now, back to the Tanzu Editions, I needed to explain this difference between running embedded and not embedded before I could get to explaining to you which of all of these products and open source tools are included in which edition. Because running embedded or not changes the equation a little bit. It changes things within the edition. So right now, this is how the editions break down. And again, you're probably not going to be familiar with many of the products and tools that are listed here. The slide is to illustrate that there are differences in which tools and which technologies VMware has chosen to go into which edition. And depending on if you try to, if you deploy workloads in the embedded cluster, or you spawn an additional Tanzu Kubernetes guest cluster, different tools work differently. Like I said, right now, today, you need NSXT in the supervisor cluster if you want to run workloads there. You do not require NSXT if you run workloads outside the supervisor cluster. If you get started with Tanzu Basic, and you don't need much to get started with it, the first cluster you will create, if you don't have NSXT, will simply be an external cluster. It consists of VMs, and it just uses the vSphere distributed switch to do its networking instead of NSXT. It'll use HA proxy for the load balancing. In fact, they don't include HA proxy. You have to include it yourself, but they give you a wizard to get the load balancing part of the ingress route, the entry into your Kubernetes cluster, to get all of that done for you. So they have a wizard that basically programs HA proxy. But if you get to Tanzu Advanced, other options start to appear. For a lot of that ingress networking stuff, they introduce one of the products that they acquired called NSX Advanced Load Balancer. And that is the new name for what is known as Avi. Avi is the company and the product that VMware acquired about 2 years ago now, that does a lot of the networking stuff around Tanzu, but it only starts to make an appearance, really, once you start moving up the editions. Some of it is already included in standard and basic. For example, the load balancing over your pods in the ingress route, but only up to layer 4. If you want layer 7, you're going to switch to a more advanced version of the product, and then you can do the same with that tool. So these are some of the differences that start to get introduced. And as you can see, not every product appears in every edition. So they also are switching different tools and technologies depending on the edition you have. With Advanced, they added a whole bunch of stuff. With Advanced, they added a number of their more advanced tools that are mostly SaaS-based, as in, they're not things you install in your own data center. They're web services that you get a subscription on. And you probably have a choice what level of subscription you want with these tools, but they become available to you from Tanzu Advanced onwards. A lot of the build tooling, a lot of the stuff that's more application oriented, more around building the containers, making sure the containers are validated, that they're secure, stuff like that starts to be included in Tanzu Advanced. They also have what they call data services, which is where they take common data services like MySQL, RabbitMQ, things like that, package them so they're very easily deployable as part of the Tanzu stack. specifically for when you're building applications that want to make use of those backend services. So this is the stuff that's now starting to appear in Tanzu Advanced. Now, Tanzu Enterprise, the final tier in the Tanzu Edition lineup, has not been announced yet. Well, it's been announced, the existence of it has been announced. We don't know what's in it yet, but you can kind of guess. Not all of the products listed here are the same ones that are on my original overview slide of the whole portfolio. So you can kind of guess what will make an appearance in Tanzu Enterprise. So that's basically the story right now. I'm going to round it off. The whole point of this presentation is to make you aware that Tanzu is not one thing. It's a very huge collection of many different tools, a combination of open source and proprietary tools. VMware has picked and chosen which of these tools to put into their Tanzu offering to build an opinionated stack that allows you to deploy Kubernetes easily, to start making use of it, and then to give you, as part of it, integrated into it, all of these other technologies and tools that you need to actually get a modern application, a modern container-based application working at scale. Like I said, like I showed you, the way you can deploy Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, there are different ways to do it. Those differences matter. They will matter less in the future, but the differences matter today a lot. And what we're seeing across this whole portfolio is that VMware is still very much in the middle of picking and choosing which of these tools to use, where and when. We're going to see changes there. We're going to see changes in which particular tool is currently used in which edition for which bit of networking. They're going to change and swap that out. What all that means is that this whole portfolio will still need some time to mature. A lot of it is still in movement. A lot of it hasn't had time to settle. And that is more true the higher you get up the stack. But it's a great way to get started with Kubernetes. And I fully expect that because of the way VMware is currently positioned, they will manage to grab a huge part of this managed Kubernetes challenge for themselves. So that was basically my story. I hope it was useful to you. I'm going to throw it open to questions, and we'll be here for another 15 minutes. First question is, are we sharing the presentation? We are sharing the presentation in PDF format. We'll provide a download link for that.
Yep, that's so good. And there was another question, Robert.
Yeah, so Tanzu is something more and different than I thought. Not only Kubernetes on ESXi, but rather a complete stack for cloud agnostic application. Yeah, that's true. That's a great way to summarize it. Yes, and yes, you're right. A large part of it is cloud agnostic, but as you can tell, VMware is putting a lot of effort on the bottom half of the portfolio to integrate it very tightly with vSphere. And in that way, it is, in that part of it, it's slightly less cloud agnostic, of course. You can expect certain features to simply not exist in a version of Tanzu Kubernetes Grid that exists in AWS or Azure. I fully suspect that the vSphere-oriented part of Tanzu Kubernetes Grid will be the one you kind of see everywhere. I don't think we're going to see much of the other deployment model. You're welcome, Mahmoud. Question, when it comes to deployment of Tanzu Basic or Standard, what is the difference? I believe there is not much difference there. No, there isn't. So the different ways you can deploy Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, at least, is identical between the different editions. The technology, the core technology stack is the same across all the editions. The only difference with the edition is that they add more stuff on the top of it to enable more advanced, more advanced features like global policy management, global security management. global networking stuff, chargeback, things like that. But no, the core deployment technology is the same across all editions. If we have vSphere 7 license, is that enough? Or we need to buy separate license to TKG? I don't know this exactly. Licensing is not my specialization. So I'm going to have to refer you to the VMware website, I'm afraid. I don't know for sure what is included in a big vSphere license and what isn't. In one of your earlier slides, you said that all services marked darker blue were not open sourced. Does that mean that they're included within Tanzu? For example, I saw Prometheus being marked dark blue, yet Prometheus is open sourced, right? Well, I think actually I might have made a mistake with that one. Let's go back to that slide. Yes, I've made a mistake. So these three, these three, I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor, but Prometheus, Grafana, and FluentBit should be teal colored. They are indeed open source projects that VMware is leveraging as part of the Tanzu Editions. And interestingly, they don't really make an appearance in BASIC, but you start seeing them as part of the editions from standard and onwards. How do I integrate external offered services from Google Azure? Very good question. I don't know. The focus currently around the Tanzu portfolio very much seems to be the vSphere integrated version. So you don't speak of integration with Tanzu in that scenario. No, I'm unable to answer. I'm not familiar enough with how Tanzu Kubernetes Grid deployed in Azure looks like to know if they're integrating Azure native services into it. I don't know. Can you tell something more about use cases, customer stories? Well, there aren't that many yet. This stuff is still pretty new. Within ITQ, we have our first customers that we are starting to experiment, maybe is the word, proof of concept, Tanzu Kubernetes Grid with. It's very early days. Out of those experiences, we are already seeing that there are differences and limitations with embedded versus not. That's where that stuff comes from. Yeah, it's still a little bit too early. But I think in a year's time, we'll have some very interesting stories to tell. The integration of SmartNICs will require which edition of Tanzu? I have no idea. Sorry. Remember, any questions that I cannot answer simply because it's not my area of expertise, please send us an email, because we have a bunch of people inside ITQ that know, for example, everything about SmartNICs. The person I would probably go to is Johan van Amersfoort. He's very involved in all that stuff around SmartNICs right now, so he can probably answer your question. So email us. I don't know what the best email for that would be, probably info@itq.eu. And I'll forward the question. Thanks for your session, Robert. This was Rudolph. Really helped me realize how low my own maturity is when it comes to cloud native. You're not the only one, believe me. This stuff was a complete black box to me less than a year ago. And you know, I've developed a broad view of this stuff, but that doesn't mean I actually have a very deep understanding of many of these things. This, as you can tell from the slide, this portfolio is so huge. There are so many technologies involved here. No one person could master this stuff. That was my point about breaking down those islands in your IT organizations. You can't do this on your own. You're going to need to involve lots of different disciplines to manage these stacks, especially as they get more complicated and bigger, right? So we're all dummies right now. That's basically what it comes down to. No one knows how to do this properly yet, or very few people. Yes, the SmartNIC stuff is Project Monterey. I know it has a relationship with Tanzu, but I don't understand what that relationship is. So if you have questions around the SmartNIC stuff, please mail, and I'll send it straight to Jan and some other people within ITQ. Let's see. Apparently, DPUs, and I don't know what that means, will integrate all of the Tanzu controllers. So like this, ESX CPUs will focus on applications. Yes. Okay. So, well, the part of the SmartNIC story I do understand is that SmartNICs are going to start doing more and more as part of delivering especially network services to these big distributed application stacks. So to see certain network services outsourced to runtimes running on SmartNICs would not surprise me in the least. We still have another 9 minutes. We're running out of questions.
Yeah, I think so too, Robert.
Yeah. Well, it's probably a good thing. Yeah. So we will make this slide deck available as a PDF. I'm not sure in which way we're going to distribute that out, but we'll probably by email, I think, to the same list. The recording of this session will also be put on ITQ's YouTube channel, where we have lots of very cool other content, also a lot of it revolving around cloud-native technologies. So I'd encourage you to have a look there. And I think with that, we'll end it.
Yeah, let's wrap it up. Have some beers for the weekend. Well, thank you very much, Robert, for bringing us into the world of Tanzu. And for all the people who are still in the meeting, have a great weekend, and maybe catch you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.